Imagine stepping into the Grand Palace of Castamar in 1671. You expect a king of power and majesty. Instead, on the throne, you see a man whose jaw hangs open, who cannot speak, who struggles to breathe in his own body. This was Esteban IV, the monarch they called El Maldito, the Cursed One. And his story is not one of demons or witchcraft, but of a dynasty that destroyed itself from within. Section 1. The Ambassador's First Glimpse. The year was 1671, and the Spanish Empire, though fraying at the edges, still glittered with the illusion of power. Don Ricardo de Villena, an ambassador from the Republic of Venice, had been summoned to the royal court of Castamar. The journey had been exhausting, weeks across treacherous roads, bandit-haunted valleys, and parched plateaus where the dust seemed to choke both horse and rider. Yet nothing could prepare him for the vision that awaited in Madrid. The palace itself was magnificent. Corridors lined with tapestries from Flanders, gilded ceilings that caught the light of thousands of candles, servants in stiff brocade uniforms gliding silently across marble floors. Ricardo, rehearsing his formal greeting, expected to meet a sovereign of majestic bearing, the sort of man whose voice could command armies and whose presence radiated divine authority. Instead, when the double doors to the throne room opened, Ricardo froze. Seated beneath a canopy of crimson velvet was a man, or what seemed barely a man at all. His body slumped sideways in the carved throne, head lolling slightly to the left. His jaw hung permanently open, the lips slack and trembling, saliva glistening at the corners. When a servant leaned forward to wipe it discreetly, the monarch did not stir. His eyes, large and watery, stared out with a strange, vacant brightness, as though trying to focus but failing. Ricardo felt his stomach turn. The figure before him was King Esteban IV of Castamar, heir to 2 centuries of dynastic pride. But he looked nothing like the image of power that portraits had promised. When Esteban attempted to speak, a hollow, gurgling sound escaped, followed by a wheeze-like wind escaping a cracked bellows. The chamberlain quickly interjected, translating the king's noises into coherent words, though Ricardo had no idea whether the man was truly interpreting or inventing the monarch's intentions. The Venetian bowed, but his mind reeled. This was not majesty, this was a nightmare given flesh. And yet the courtiers bowed, whispered their praise, and behaved as though the sovereign were the very embodiment of divine right. Later that evening, as Ricardo sat at a feast held in his honor, he confided in a fellow diplomat from Florence. "Tell me," Ricardo murmured, keeping his eyes fixed on the silver platter of figs before him, "how is it that this man rules an empire spanning oceans?" The Florentine smiled bitterly. "My friend, Esteban does not rule. He is ruled. By his priests, his ministers, his mother. But mark me, it is not witchcraft that made him this way, as the people whisper. It is blood, his own cursed blood." The words lingered in Ricardo's mind like smoke. Section 2. The Roots of a Curse. To understand why King Esteban IV sat drooling on a throne of gold, one had to look back through the twisted corridors of his ancestry. The House of Castamar was once the envy of Christendom. For generations their banners flew over continents. Their fleets sailed from Lisbon to Lima, from Naples to the Indies. But with power came fear, fear of losing it to outsiders, fear of tainting the royal blood with what they deemed inferior lines. So, the Castamars devised a solution. They would marry only each other. It began subtly, a cousin to a cousin here, an uncle to a niece there. But within 2 centuries, the family tree ceased to resemble a tree at all. It was a knot, a tangled snarl where the same names appeared again and again, looped into a web of desperation. The chronicles record warnings. In 1552, the royal physician Francisco de Almaraz presented a report to King Rodrigo II. "If His Majesty persists in marriages so close of kin, the blood will thicken like spoiled wine, and heirs will be born with strange afflictions." Rodrigo dismissed him with a wave. "Our house is chosen by God. What He ordains, no man may undo." But God, it seemed, had given warning after warning. Stillbirths became common in the royal nurseries. Infants died with their lips blue and their limbs twisted. Those who survived bore peculiar traits: jaws that jutted grotesquely forward, heads too large for their bodies, and eyes that drifted apart like those of a fish. By the time Esteban was born in 1667, the bloodline was more concentrated than a vial of poison. Geneticists today would calculate his inbreeding coefficient at 0.28, worse than the child of brother and sister. Of the 16 great-grandparents any ordinary man would possess, Esteban had 7. Entire generations had folded in upon themselves like paper creased too many times. His grandmother, Isabella of Leon, had been both his father's aunt and cousin. His great-grandfather, Rodrigo III, appeared 3 separate times in his lineage. The court poet once quipped in private that the family had so often married themselves that soon they would give birth to their own shadows. When Esteban was born, the midwives gasped. His skull was enormous, his tiny limbs frail. His mouth hung open even as an infant, tongue lolling forward as though it were too heavy for him to contain. The Queen Mother, Mariana, clutched the child and whispered, "It is the will of heaven." The midwives, under pain of death, said nothing. Yet in the kitchens, in the barracks, in the taverns of Madrid, people whispered another name, El Maldito, the Cursed One. Section 3. The Childhood of the Cursed Prince. From the moment of his birth, young Esteban was surrounded not by joy but by silence and dread. The bells of Madrid, which should have rung triumphantly to herald the arrival of an heir, tolled only briefly. Then, under orders of Queen Mother Mariana, they fell quiet. She did not want the people to ask questions. Questions that might force them to face what had been born in the royal cradle. Esteban's infancy was marked by delay after delay. At 6 months, he could not hold his head upright. It lolled to one side like a broken stalk. At 2 years, he had not spoken a single word. Instead, guttural noises, groans and wet clicks of the tongue, escaped his mouth. By 4 years old, when most princes would already be learning letters and swordplay, Esteban still could not walk. Servants had to carry him from chamber to chamber in padded chairs, his thin legs dangling uselessly. Nurses whispered behind closed doors, "This is no child. He is a punishment. Hush, or the Queen will hear you." She had the last nurse whipped for saying as much. But no silencing could erase the truth. The boy frightened those tasked with raising him. His eyes, watery and bulging, seemed too wide for his face. They would wander in opposite directions as if his gaze could not agree on where to rest. Worse still was his jaw. Already, the notorious Castamar jaw was pronounced, a grotesque protrusion that forced his mouth open permanently, leaving him to drool and choke even in sleep. When Esteban turned 5, a painter, Diego Morales, was summoned to make the boy's first official portrait. Morales expected a delicate, angelic child in silks. What he encountered instead haunted him. In letters to his brother he confessed, "The prince has the visage of a saint melted in wax. His eyes hold sorrow beyond years, yet his body is like a puppet half-carved. I painted what I must, but in truth I have nightmares still." Court life revolved around concealing the deformities. When foreign envoys came, Esteban was propped upright in chairs specially designed to support his neck. Meals were pureed and spoon-fed to avoid the humiliating spectacle of his food spilling down his chin. And when he tried to speak, courtiers rushed to interpret his mumbles before guests could notice the incoherence. Yet the boy himself was not unaware. One evening, his tutor Father Hernando found him weeping silently in his bed. "Why do they look at me so?" Esteban managed to mumble through his twisted jaw. The priest hesitated, then replied, "Because you are chosen, my prince. Chosen by heaven to bear more than other men." The boy shook his oversized head. "No. I am cursed." In that moment, Father Hernando realized the truth. The prince did not need whispers to know what he was. He carried his curse in every movement, every labored breath. Section 4. The growing horror in the royal court. As Esteban grew older, the secrecy became harder to maintain. Children in the palace, those of noble families visiting court, could not be silenced as easily as servants. At a festival when Esteban was 7, the son of a Genoese diplomat was presented to him. The boy took one look at the prince's gaping mouth, his lurching attempt to rise from the throne, and screamed, "Demonio! A demon!" The chamber fell into stunned silence. Esteban froze, his wide eyes filling with tears, while courtiers scrambled to hush the foreign child. Diplomats tried to smooth over the incident as childish folly, but the damage was done. Rumors spread through Madrid like wildfire. By nightfall, the taverns echoed with whispers that the heir to Castamar's throne was not entirely human. In desperation, Queen Mother Mariana tightened her grip on the palace. Guards were doubled. Servants were rotated frequently so no one knew too much of the boy's true condition. Painters were instructed to improve Esteban's likeness in portraits, softening the jaw, straightening the gaze, giving him an air of frail dignity. But even the most skilled brush could not entirely erase reality. By adolescence, Esteban's difficulties multiplied. His legs, weak since birth, never grew strong. He shuffled from wall to wall, using furniture to support his hunched frame. He tired easily, often collapsing in tears of frustration. His tutors noted that he struggled to retain lessons. When presented with scripture, he could memorize passages through sheer repetition, but comprehension slipped through him like water through a sieve. At a council meeting, one minister dared to suggest that the prince was unfit to rule. Mariana's eyes narrowed, and the man was sent away to govern a remote province. "My son is God's chosen," she declared. "To question him is to question heaven." No one dared raise the matter again. But whispers persisted. Servants spoke of strange noises in the night, half wails, half gurgles, that drifted from the prince's chambers. A maid swore she had seen him convulse in bed, gasping as though invisible hands pressed upon his chest. Some crossed themselves, certain it was possession. Others murmured that no demon was needed, his blood itself was curse enough. And so, the boy grew into adolescence not as a symbol of hope but as a secret burden, hidden behind layers of denial, ritual, and fear. Section 5. The Prince at 15, a Kingdom in Denial. By the time Esteban reached 15, the court could no longer pretend he was merely delicate. His deformities had become impossible to ignore. His jaw jutted so far forward that even when his mouth was closed, a gap remained large enough for a servant to slide 2 fingers between his teeth. His tongue, thick and unwieldy, made speech a constant struggle. The boy would force sounds from his throat, only for them to collapse into slurred half-words. "Your Highness must not strain himself," Queen Mother Mariana would interrupt whenever Esteban tried to speak at ceremonies. She would gesture to the chamberlain, who would then interpret his words. To foreign envoys this charade was absurd, but none dared expose the lie openly. Meals were still a grotesque spectacle. Palace cooks spent hours turning delicacies into mush so the prince could swallow without choking. Even then, half the food dribbled from his lips, soaking into his embroidered collars. At one state dinner, a French envoy was horrified when Esteban coughed violently, spraying bits of half-chewed bread into a golden goblet. Courtiers rushed to cover the moment with forced laughter, but the Frenchman later wrote to his king, "The heir of Castamar is scarcely more than an invalid. His body betrays him at every turn." The most painful aspect, however, was Esteban's awareness of his own humiliation. On one occasion, during Mass in the palace chapel, he tried to kneel but toppled forward, collapsing against the altar rail. As priests scrambled to lift him, Esteban buried his face in his hands and sobbed, his voice breaking into a keening wail that silenced the entire congregation. Later, alone with Father Hernando, he whispered, "Why does God make me king, if he makes me less than a man?" The priest had no answer. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the people's patience waned. Spain, still vast in territory, was bleeding from within. Trade from the colonies faltered, peasants starved under crushing taxes, and soldiers returned from distant wars unpaid. To the starving crowds of Madrid, the idea that their suffering was endured for the sake of a sickly boy prince seemed less like divine will and more like mockery. Still, Mariana clung to her belief. To admit her son's unfitness would unravel the dynasty. He will marry, she insisted to the council. He will produce heirs. The blood of Castamar will endure. But even the most loyal advisers secretly doubted. For how could a young man who could barely stand rule an empire on which the sun never set? Section 6. The Marriage of Shadows. By the time Esteban turned 18, Queen Mother Mariana declared it was time for him to marry. Not out of love, of course, no one in the palace entertained such illusions, but out of desperation. Only an heir could secure the throne, and only marriage could silence the growing murmur that God had cursed the house of Castamar. After months of negotiation, the chosen bride was announced, Princess Caterina of Aragon, a cousin from the French branch of the family. She was 17, bright-eyed, and, most importantly, obedient. Her dowry was less important than her womb. The courtiers whispered it openly. Her sole duty is to give him sons. The wedding was staged as a spectacle of majesty. Golden processions through Madrid, hymns sung by choirs, and a banquet where hundreds of dishes were paraded before nobles and ambassadors. But when the bride and groom appeared together, the illusion wavered. Esteban, pale and hunched, shuffled forward with assistance, his jaw slack, his embroidered doublet already damp with drool. Caterina, slim and graceful in her pearl-dotted veil, looked as though she were being led to an execution. During the vows, Esteban tried to say the sacred words, but only a wet gurgle emerged. The archbishop, flustered, quickly spoke on his behalf. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. Caterina's hands trembled as she took his. The wedding night became the subject of whispered scandal. Servants outside the chamber reported muffled sobbing, first the queen, then the king. The following morning, Caterina emerged pale, her eyes swollen from crying. Esteban did not appear at all. He remained in bed, refusing to eat. In the months that followed, it became clear to everyone but Mariana that no heir would ever be born. Esteban's body was incapable. Court physicians, summoned in secret, whispered words the Queen Mother refused to hear. Undeveloped, impotent, barren. Their reports were burned before they could reach the council. Caterina withered in the gilded cage of the palace. Once lively and curious, she grew gaunt, her laughter vanishing, her days spent kneeling in chapels, whispering prayers into the stone. She wrote to her family in France. I am bound to a ghost. He is not cruel, only pitiful. Yet each night feels like dying anew. In Madrid, the people muttered, the king could not speak, could not walk without stumbling, could not sire heirs. And still, the empire pretended. Section 7. Whispers of Witchcraft and the Turn to the Supernatural. When the months stretched into years with no sign of a royal child, the court needed a scapegoat. No one dared blame Esteban. To question the king was treason, and to admit his incapacity was to unravel the empire itself. So, eyes turned to Caterina. Whispers spread that the young queen was barren, that she had secretly cursed her husband's seed. Servants muttered that she refused to embrace him in the marriage bed, that she wore charms from her French homeland to ward off conception. It mattered little that Esteban's condition was obvious to every physician who examined him. The blame had to fall elsewhere. Mariana, the Queen Mother, leaned eagerly into the fiction. It is Caterina's fault, she told the council. She has bewitched him. Her words ignited a frenzy. Soon, priests were called into the palace, carrying relics and holy water. Exorcists muttered Latin over the royal bed, sprinkling salt into its corners as though evil spirits lurked between the sheets. The first great public exorcism took place in the throne room itself. Nobles and foreign envoys were summoned, forced to witness the spectacle. Esteban was led in, trembling, his mouth hanging open. Father Alonso de Rueda, the chief exorcist, raised a crucifix above the boy king's head and shouted, "Depart, foul spirits! Leave the body of God's anointed!" Servants restrained Esteban as he convulsed, not from demons but from the shock of cold holy water splashed onto his frail body. He gagged and vomited across the marble floor. Courtiers crossed themselves. Some whispered that they truly saw shadows fleeing from him, Others simply shut their eyes and prayed the humiliation would end. That evening, the Venetian ambassador wrote in his journal, "What I saw today was more pitiful than any torture I have witnessed in war. A king treated as a vessel for demons, his body failing him while his priests pretend to save what cannot be saved." But Esteban himself began to believe. His mind, clouded by years of suffering and sheltered by superstition, accepted the priest's words. "The devils are in me," he confessed to Father Hernando. "Drive them out. Do it again." And so he begged for more exorcisms, more rituals, convinced each convulsion, each choking spasm, was proof that the demons resisted but had not yet departed. The court, desperate for hope, indulged him. Each ritual became grander, more theatrical. Bonfires burned in the palace courtyard, filled with objects declared tainted by sorcery. Caterina's gowns, her jewelry, even books from the royal library, all fed to the flames. Yet nothing changed. The king remained broken, and the empire grew weaker with each passing day. Section 8. The Last Days of Esteban IV. By the late 1690s, the empire of Castamar was a hollow shell of its former glory. Its fleets, once proud, were rotting in harbors. Its armies, once feared, now mutinied for lack of pay. And at the center of it all sat Esteban IV, a man barely able to stand, clinging to life by sheer inertia. His hair had fallen in brittle clumps, leaving his scalp patchy and raw. His skin, once pale, turned waxy, sallow, and covered in sores no physician could cure. He no longer walked without assistance. Servants carried him from chamber to chamber like a broken idol. The people no longer called him El Maldito in whispers. They said it openly in taverns and marketplaces. He was cursed, yes, but not by demons, by his own family's arrogance. In 1700, Esteban collapsed after a long night of convulsions. His priests rushed to perform one final exorcism, chanting and pressing relics against his frail body. But this time, he did not rise. At 33 years old, the last king of Castamar breathed his last in a palace thick with the smoke of burning incense and the stale odor of decay. His autopsy was quietly recorded by court physicians. They found his body a horror, organs shriveled or misshapen, his heart the size of a walnut, his stomach filled with rotted fluid, his skull far larger than nature intended. One physician wrote privately, "It is a marvel he lived as long as he did. He was less man than shadow, sustained only by will and God's cruel humor." With Esteban's death, the dynasty of Castamar ended. No heirs, no sons, no continuation of the bloodline they had sacrificed everything to preserve. Europe erupted into war over the scraps of the empire, a conflict that drenched the continent in blood for over a decade. And so, the great house that once ruled oceans and empires was undone not by enemies, not by assassins, not even by God's wrath, but by itself. By the pride of rulers who believed their blood was too sacred to mix, who thought power could be preserved by isolation. Esteban IV became the symbol of that folly, a king who could not speak, could not eat without shame, could not father heirs, could not even close his own mouth. His twisted body was history's verdict, a final judgment written in flesh and bone. The empire had pursued purity, and purity destroyed it.